Alright. You know what time it is. It is blog time. Blog time. So, now we're on to the chapter An Army on the March. Cool. Very cool. And the first quote sums it up very nicely. It's from Sidney Farber himself. And he says, "We are an army on the march." That's great, Sidney Farber. Wonderful. And the second quote is, "The next step to complete cure is almost sure to follow." And that is from Kenneth Endicott, the NCI director in 1963. And then the third quote, yes, there's a third quote, is, "The role of aggressive multiple drug therapy in the quest for long-term survival in cancer is far from clear." And that is R. Stein, a scientist in 1969. Okay. One afternoon in the late summer of 1963, George Canelos, then a senior fellow at the NCI, walked into the clinical center to find Tom Fry scribbling furiously on one of the institute's blackboards. Fry, in his long white coat, was making lists of chemicals and drawing arrows. On one side of the board was a complete list of cytotoxic drugs: Cytoxan, vincristine, procarbazine, and methotrexate. On the other side was a list of new cancers that Zubrod and Fry wanted to target: breast, ovarian, lung cancers, lymphomas. Connecting the two halves of the blackboard were chalky lines matching combinations of cytotoxic drugs to cancers. For a moment, it almost looked as if Fry had been deriving mathematical equations. A plus B kills C, E plus F eliminates G. The drugs on Fry's list came largely from three sources. Some, such as aminopterin or methotrexate, were the products of inspired guesswork by scientists. Farber had discovered the anti-cancer activity of aminopterin by guessing that an antifolate might block the growth of leukemia cells. Others, such as nitrogen mustard or actinomycin D, came from serendipitous sources, such as mustard gas or soil bacteria, found accidentally to kill cancer cells. Yet others, such as 6-MP, came from drug screening efforts in which thousands of molecules were tested to find a handful that possessed cancer-killing activity. The notable common feature that linked all these drugs was that they were all rather indiscriminate inhibitors of cellular growth. Nitrogen mustard, for instance, damages DNA and kills nearly all dividing cells. It kills cancer cells somewhat preferentially because cancer cells divide most actively. To design an ideal anti-cancer drug, one would need to identify a specific molecular target in a cancer cell and create a chemical to attack that target. But the fundamental biology of cancer was so poorly understood that defining such molecular targets was virtually inconceivable in the 1960s. Yet, even lacking such targets, Fry and Freireich had cured leukemia in some children. Even generic cellular poisons, dosed with adequate brio, could thus eventually obliterate cancer. What is brio? The bravado of that logic was certainly hypnotic. Vincent DeVita, another fellow at the Institute during that time, wrote, "A new breed of cancer investigators in the 1960s had been addressing the generic question of whether or not cytotoxic chemotherapy was ever capable of curing patients with any type of advanced malignancies." For Fry and Zubrod, the only way to answer that generic question was to direct the growing armamentarium of combination chemotherapy against another cancer, a solid tumor this time, which would retrace their steps with leukemia. If yet another kind of cancer responded to this strategy, then there could be little doubt that oncology had stumbled upon a generic solution to the generic problem. A cure would be within reach for all cancers. But which cancer would be used to test the principle? Like Kaplan, Zubrod, DeVita, and Kanellos also focused on Hodgkin's disease, a cancer that lived on the ill-defined cusp between solid and liquid, a stepping stone between leukemia and, say, lung cancer or breast cancer. At Stanford, Kaplan had already demonstrated that Hodgkin's lymphoma could be staged with exquisite precision and that the locust disease could be cured with high-dose extended-field radiation. Kaplan had solved half the equation. He had used local therapy with radiation to cure localized forms of Hodgkin's disease. If metastatic Hodgkin's disease could be cured by systemic and aggressive combination chemotherapy, then Zubrod's generic solution would begin to sound plausible. The equation would be fully solved. Give me a second. There we go. Just gotta put that piece in. Also, there was another piece. Give me a second. There was another piece. There was another. Where is it? I just had it. We just had it. Whatever, I'll figure it out. There was a break, by the way. Outspoken, pugnacious, and bold, a child of the rough and tumble Yonkers area of New York, who had bulldozed his way through college and medicinal school, Vincent DeVita had come to the NCI in 1963 and fallen into the intoxicating orbit of Zubrod, Fry, and Freireich. The unorthodoxy of their approach, the maniacs doing cancer research, as he called it, had instantly fascinated him. These were the daredevils of medicinal research, acrobatics, devising new drugs that nearly killed patients. These men played chicken with death. Somebody had to show the skeptics that you could actually cure cancer with the right drugs, he believed. In the early months of 1964, he set out to prove the skeptics wrong. The first test of intensive combination chemotherapy for advanced stage Hodgkin's disease, led by DeVita, combined 4 drugs: methotrexate, vincristine, also called oncovin, nitrogen mustard, and prednisone, a highly toxic cocktail called MOMP. Only 14 patients were treated. All suffered the predictable consequences of combination chemotherapy. All were hospitalized and confined in isolation chambers to prevent infections during the life-threatening drop in blood counts. As expected, the regimen was sharply criticized by the MCI. This, again, was a quantum leap into a deadly world of mixed poisons. But Fry intervened, silencing the critics and allowing the program to continue. In 1964, DeVita modified the regimen further. Methotrexate was substituted with a more powerful agent, procarbazine, and the duration of treatment was lengthened from 2.5 months to 6 months. With a team of young, like-minded fellows at the NCI, DeVita began to enroll patients with advanced Hodgkin's disease in a trial of this new cocktail called MOP. Like lymphoblastic leukemia, Hodgkin's disease is a rare illness, but the researchers did not need to look hard to find patients. Advanced Hodgkin's disease, often accompanied by the spectral B symptoms, was uniformly fatal. Young men and women, the disease usually strikes men and women in their 20s and 30s, were often referred to the NCI as hopeless cases, and thus ideal experimental subjects. In just 3 years, DeVita and Kanellos thus accumulated cases at a furious clip, 41 patients and all. 9 had been blasted with increasing fields of radiation, a la Kaplan, and still progressed inexorably to disseminated, widely metastatic disease. Others had been treated with an ad hoc mix of single agents. None had shown any durable response to prior drugs. So, like the younger band of leukemics that had gone before them, a fresh new cohort appeared at the institute every 2 weeks, occupying the plastic chairs of the clinical center, lining up for the government-issued cookies, and awaiting the terrifying onslaught of the experimental drugs. The youngest was 12, not even a teenager yet, with lymphoma cells packed in her lungs and liver. A 13-year-old boy had Hodgkin's in his pleural cavity. Malignant fluid had compressed itself into the lining between his chest wall and lung and made it hard to breathe. The oldest was a 69 woman with Hodgkin's disease choking off the entrance to her intestine. Yikes. That was another break, by the way. If the terror of VAMP was death by infection, children slumped on ventilators with no white blood cells to speak of, and bacteria streaming in their blood, then the terror of MOP was more visceral, death by nausea. The nausea that accompanied the therapy was devastating. It appeared suddenly, then abated just as suddenly, almost capable of snapping the mind shut with its intensity. Many of the patients on the protocol were flown in from nearby cities every fortnight. The trip back home, with the drugs lurching in the blood and the plane lurching in the air, was for many a nightmare even worse than their disease. The nausea was merely a harbinger, as DeVita charged ahead with combination chemotherapy. More complex and novel devastations were revealed. Chemotherapy caused permanent sterility in men and some women. The annihilation of the immune system by the cytotoxic drugs allowed peculiar infections to sprout up. The first adult case of a rare form of pneumonia caused by an organism, Pneumocystis carinii, or PCP, was observed in a patient receiving MOP. The same pneumonia, arising spontaneously in immune-compromised gay men in 1981, would augur the arrival of the HIV epidemic in America. Perhaps the most disturbing side effect of chemotherapy would emerge nearly a decade later. Several young men and women cured of Hodgkin's disease would relapse with a second cancer, typically an aggressive drug-resistant leukemia caused by the prior treatment with MOP chemotherapy. As with radiation, cytotoxic chemotherapy would thus turn out to be a double-edged sword, cancer curing on one hand and cancer causing on the other. But the evidently grim litany of side effects notwithstanding, even early in the course of treatment, there was payoff. In many of the young men and women, the palpable swollen lymph nodes dissolved in weeks. A 12-year-old boy from Illinois had been so ravaged by Hodgkin's that his weight had sunk to 50 pounds, and within 3 months of treatment, he gained nearly half his body weight and shot up 2 feet in height. In others, the stranglehold of Hodgkin's disease loosened on the organs. Pleural effusions gradually cleared, and the nodes in the gut disappeared. As the months passed, it was clear that combination chemo had struck gold once again. At the end of half a year, 35 of the 43 patients had achieved a complete remission. The MOP trial did not have a control group, but one was not needed to discern the effect. The response and remission rate was unprecedented for advanced Hodgkin's disease. The success would continue in the long term. More than half the initial cohort of patients would be cured. Even Kaplan, not an early believer in chemotherapy, was astonished. Some of the patients with advanced disease had now survived relapse-free, he wrote. Have now survived relapse-free. The advent of multiple drug chemotherapy had dramatically changed the prognosis of patients with previously untreated stage 3 or stage 4 Hodgkin's disease. And that was another break. I swear we had another piece. Oof. Something's up with my neck. Keep cracking it. Seems to be cracking more often than normal. Alright, let's keep going. We have, 2 pages until the next one, and then 2 pages until the end of the chapter. Well done. In May 1968, as the MOP trial was ascending to its unexpected crescendo, there was equally unexpected news in the world of lymphoblastic leukemia. Fry and Freireich's VAMP regimen had trailed off at a strange and bleak point. Combination chemo had cured most of the children of leukemia in their blood and bone marrow, but the cancer had explosively relapsed in the brain. In the months following VAMP in 1962, most of these children had hobbled back to the clinic with seemingly innocuous neurological complaints and then spiraled furiously towards their death just a week or two afterwards. VAMP, once widely touted as the Institute's success story, had turned instead into its progressive nightmare. Of the 15 patients treated on the initial protocol, only 2 survived. At the NCI, the ambition and bravado that had spurred the original studies was rapidly tipping towards a colder reality. Perhaps Farber's critics had been right. Perhaps lymphoblastic leukemia was a disease that could, at best, be sent into a flickering remission, but never cured. Perhaps palliative care was the best option after all. But having tasted the success of high-dose chemotherapy, many oncologists could not scale back their optimism. What if even VAMP had not been intensive enough? What if a chemotherapy regimen could be muscled up further, pushed closer to the brink of tolerability? Oof. The leader of this gladiatorial group was a 36-year-old oncologist, Donald Pinkel, who had been recruited from Boston to start a leukemia program in Memphis, Tennessee. In many ways, Memphis was the antipode of Boston, convulsing with bitter racial tensions and rock and roll music, gyrating between the gold and pink of the Graceland mansion in its south and the starkly segregated black neighborhoods in its north. Memphis was a turbulent, unpredictable, colorful, perennially warm, and, medicinally speaking, virtually a no-man's land. Pinkel's new hospital, called St. Jude's, named aptly enough after the patron saint of lost causes, rose like a marooned concrete starfish out of a concrete parking lot on a barren field. In 1961, when Pinkel arrived, the hospital was barely functional, with no track record, uncertain finances, and an unfinished building, no employees or faculty. Still, Pinkel got a chemotherapy ward up and running, with nurses, residents, and fellows trained in administering the toxic mercurial drugs. And flown far from the epicenters of leukemia research in New York and Boston, Pinkel's team was determined to outdo every other leukemia trial, the edge outmoding the center, to push the logic of high-dose combination chemotherapy to its extreme. Pinkel thus hammered away on trial after trial, edging his way towards the outer limit of tolerability. And Pinkel and his collaborators emerged with 4 crucial innovations to the prior regimens. First, Pinkel reasoned that while combinations of drugs were necessary to induce remissions, combinations were insufficient in themselves. Perhaps one needed combinations of combinations, 6, 7, or even 8 different chemical poisons mixed and matched together for maximum effect. Second, since the nervous system relapses had likely occurred because even those highly potent chemicals could not breach the blood-brain barrier, perhaps one needed to instill chemotherapy directly into the nervous system by injecting it into the fluid that bathes the spinal cord. That doesn't sound like a good idea, but who am I to say that? Third, perhaps even that installation was not good enough. Since X-rays could penetrate the brain regardless of the blood-brain barrier, perhaps one needed to add high-dose radiation to the skull to kill residual cells in the brain. And finally, as Min-Shu Lee had seen with choriocarcinoma, perhaps one needed to continue chemotherapy, not just for weeks or months as Freireich and Frey had done, but for month after month, stretching into 2 or 3 years. Wonderful. The treatment protocol that emerged from these guiding principles could only be described as one of Pinkel's colleagues called it, an all-out combat. To start with, the standard anti-leukemic drugs were given in rapid-fire succession. Then, at defined intervals, methotrexate was injected into the spinal canal using a spinal tap. The brain was irradiated with high doses of X-rays. Then, chemotherapy was boosted even further with high doses of drugs and alternating intervals in maximum tolerated doses. Antibiotics and transfusions were usually needed often in succession, often for weeks on end. The treatment lasted up to 2.5 years. It involved multiple exposures to radiation, scores of blood tests, dozens of spinal taps, and multiple intravenous drugs, a strategy so precise and demanding that one journal refused to publish it, concerned that it was impossible to even dose and monitor it correctly without killing several patients in the trials. Even at St. Jude's, the regimen was considered so overwhelmingly toxic that the trial was assigned to relatively junior physicians under Pinkel's supervision because the senior researchers, knowing its risks, did not want to run it. Pinkel called it total therapy. As fellows, we called it total hell. And we enter our last break. And I'm gonna just come on. There we go. Oh, you're quite far away. Let's move you closer. Carla Reed entered this form of hell in the summer of 2004. Chemotherapy and radiation came back to back, one dark tide after another. Some days she got home in the evening, her children already in bed, her husband waiting with dinner, only to turn around and come back the next morning. She lost sleep, her hair, and her appetite, and then something more important and ineffable: her animus, her drive, her will. She walked around the hospital like a zombie, shuffling in small steps from the blue vinyl couch in the infusion room to the water dispenser in the central corridor, then back to the couch in those evenly measured steps. The radiation treatment was the last straw, she recalled. Lying on the treatment table as still as death, with the mask on my face, I often wondered whether I would even wake up. Even her mother, who had flown in and out of Boston regularly during Carla's month of treatment, retreated to her own house in Florida, red-eyed and exhausted. Carla withdrew even more deeply into her own world. Her melancholy hardened to something impenetrable, a carapace, and she pulled into it instinctually, shutting everything out. She lost her friends. During her first few visits, I noticed that she often brought a cheerful young woman as a companion. One morning, I noticed that the friend was missing. "No company today?" I asked. Carla looked away and shrugged her shoulders. We had a falling out. There was something steely, mechanical in her voice. She needed to be needed, and he just couldn't fulfill that demand, not now. I found myself, embarrassingly enough, sympathizing with the missing friend. As Carla's doctor, I needed to be missing as well. I needed to be needed as well. But to be acknowledged, even as a peripheral participant in her battle. But Carla had barely any emotional energy for her own recuperation, and certainly none to spare for the needs of others. For her, the struggle with leukemia had been so deeply personalized, so interiorized, that the rest of us were ghostly onlookers in the periphery. We were the zombies walking outside her head. Her clinic visits began and ended with awkward pauses. Walking across the hospital in the morning to draw yet another bone marrow biopsy, with a wintry light cross-hatching the rooms, I felt a certain dread descending on me, a heaviness that bordered on sympathy, but never quite achieved it. Test came after test. 7 months into her course, Carla had now visited the clinic 66 times, had had 58 blood tests, 7 spinal taps, and several bone marrow biopsies. One writer, a former nurse, described the typical course of total therapy in terms of the tests involved. From the time of his diagnosis, Eric's illness had lasted 628 days. He had spent 1/4 of these days either in a hospital bed or visiting the doctors. He had received more than 800 blood tests, numerous spinal and bone marrow taps, 30 x-rays, 120 biochemical tests, and more than 210 transfusions. No fewer than 20 doctors, hematologists, pulmonologists, neurologists, surgeons, specialists, and so on, were involved in this treatment, not including the physiologist and a dozen nurses. And we come to our last break, which I didn't even see because it was once again at the end of the page. And we have like half a page left in this chapter, so, you know. How Pinkel and his team convinced 4- and 6-year-olds in Memphis to complete the typical routine remains a mystery in its own right. but he did. In July 1968, the St. Jude's team published its preliminary data on the results of the most advanced iteration of total therapy. Pinkel's team would run 8 consecutive trials between 1968 and 1979, each adding another modification to the regimen. This particular trial, an early variant, was non-randomized and small, a single hospital's experience with a single cohort of patients. But despite all the caveats, the result was electrifying. The Memphis team had treated 31 patients in all. 27 of them had attained a full remission. The median time to relapse, the time between diagnosis and relapse, a measure of the efficiency of treatment, has stretched out to nearly 5 years, more than 20 times the longest remissions achieved by most of Farber's first patients. But most important, 13 patients, about a third of the original cohort, had never relapsed. They were still alive off chemotherapy. The children had come back to the clinic month after month. The longest remission was now in its 6th year, half the lifetime of the child. In 1979, Pinkel's team revisited the entire cohort of patients treated over several years with total therapy. Overall, 278 patients in 8 consecutive trials had completed their courses of medicines and stopped chemotherapy. Of these, about 1/5 had relapsed. The rest, 80%, remained disease-free after chemotherapy. Cured, as far as anyone could tell. ALL in children cannot be considered an incurable disease, Pinkel wrote in a review article. Palliation is no longer an acceptable approach to its initial treatment. He was writing to the future, of course, but in a more mystical sense, he was writing back to the past, to the doctors who had been so deeply nihilistic about therapy for leukemia and had once argued with Farber to let his children quietly die in peace. And that's the end of the chapter. Alright, let's go. I mean, like, how much? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ooh, 8.5. 8.5. Okay, we can do this. So, The Cart and the Horse is the next chapter. And we have 2 quotes. I am not opposed to optimism, but I am fearful of the kind that comes from self-delusion. And that is Marvin Davis in the New England Journal of Medicine, talking about the cure for cancer. And here is another one. The iron is hot, and this is the time to pound without cessation. And this is from Sidney Farber to Mary Lasker, September 1965. One swallow is a coincidence, but 2 swallows make summer. By the autumn of 1968, as the trials in Bethesda and in Memphis announced their noteworthy successes, the landscape of cancer witnessed a seismic shift. In the late 50s, as DeVita recalled, it took plain old courage to be a chemotherapist, and certainly the courage of the conviction that cancer would eventually succumb to drugs. Clearly, proof was necessary. Just a decade later, the burden of proof began to shift dramatically. The cure for lymphoblastic leukemia with high-dose chemotherapy might have been dismissed as a biological fluke, but the success of the same strategy in Hodgkin's disease made it seem like a general principle. A revolution has been set in motion, DeVita wrote. Kenneth Endicott, the NCI director, concurred. The next step, the complete cure, is almost sure to follow. In Boston, Farber greeted the news by celebrating the way he knew best, by throwing a massive public party. The symbolic date for the party was not hard to come by. In September 1968, the Jimmy Fund turned 21. Farber recast the occasion as the symbolic 21st birthday of Jimmy, a coming-of-age moment for his child with cancer. The Imperial Ballroom of the Statler Hotel, outside of which the Variety Club had once positioned its baseball-sized donation box for Jimmy in the 1950s, was outfitted for a colossal celebration. The guest list included Farber's typically glitzy retinue of physicians, scientists, philanthropists, and politicians. Mary Lasker couldn't attend the event, but she sent Elmer Bobst from the ACS. Zubrod threw up. Zubrod threw up. Zubrod flew up from the NCI. Kenneth Endicott came from Bethesda. Conspicuously missing from the list was the original Jimmy himself, Einar Gustafsson. Farber knew of Jimmy's whereabouts. He was alive and well, Farber told the press opaquely, but deliberately chose to shroud the rest in anonymity. Jimmy, Farber insisted, was an icon, an abstraction. The real Jimmy had returned to a private, cloistered life on a farm in rural Maine, where he now lived with his wife and 3 children. His restored normalcy, a sign of victory against cancer. He was 32 years old. No one had seen or photographed him for nearly 2 decades. At the end of the evening, as the Demitasse cups were being wheeled away, Farber rose to the stage in the full glare of the lights. Jimmy's clinic, he said, now stood at the most fortunate time in the history of science and medicine. Institutes and individuals across the nation, the Variety Club, the motion picture industry, the Boston Braves, the Red Sox, the world of sports, the press, the television, the radio, had come together around cancer. What was being celebrated in the ballroom that evening, Farber announced, was not an individual's birthday, but the birth of a once beleaguered community that had clustered around the disease. The community now felt at the verge of a breakthrough. As DeVita described it, the missing piece of the therapeutic puzzle, effective chemotherapy for systemic cancers, had been discovered. High-dose combination chemotherapy would cure all cancers, once the right combinations had been found. The chemical arsenal, one writer noticed, now in the hands of prescribing physicians, gives them every bit as much power as the heroic surgeon wielding the knife at the turn of the century. The prospect of a systemic solution to a cure intoxicated... give me a second. The prospect of a systemic solution to a cure intoxicated ontologists. It equally intoxicated the political forces that had converged around cancer. Potent, hungry, and expansive, the word war captured the essence of the anti-cancer campaign. Wars demanded combatants, weapons, soldiers, the wounded, survivors, bystanders, collaborators, strategists, sentinels, victories. And it was not hard to find a metaphorical analog to each of these for this war as well. War also demanded a clear definition of an enemy. They imbue even formless adversaries with forms, so cancer, a shape-shifting disease of colossal diversity, was recast as a single monolithic entity. It was one disease. As Isaiah Fidler, the Houston oncologist, described it succinctly, cancer was thought to possess one cause, one mechanism, and one cure. Oh, man. If clinical oncologists had multi-drug cytotoxic chemotherapy to offer as their unifying solution of cancer, one cure, then cancer scientists had their own theory to advance for its unifying cause, viruses. The grandfather of this theory was Peyton Roos, a stooping, white-haired chicken virologist who had been roosting quietly in a laboratory at the Rockefeller Institute in New York until he was dragged out of relative oblivion in the 1960s. In 1909, Halsted had just wrapped up his study of the mastectomy, and Neely was yet to advertise his reward for the cure of cancer. And a 30-year-old scientist, freshly launching his lab at the Rockefeller Institute, was what Peyton Roos was. I'm kind of improvising because how it's written is not really meant for being said aloud. Peyton Roos had been brought a tumor growing on the back of a hen of a black and white species of chicken called Plymouth Rock. A rare tumor in a chicken might have left others unimpressed, but the indefatigable Roos secured a $200 grant to study the chicken cancer. Soon, he had categorized the tumor as a sarcoma, a cancer of the connective tissues, with sheet after sheet of rhomboid foxide cells invading the tendons and muscle. Roos's initial work on the chicken sarcoma was thought to have little relevance to human cancers. In the 1920s, the only known causes of human cancer were environmental carcinogens such as radium, or organic chemicals such as paraffin or dye, that were known to cause solid tumors. In the late 18th century, an English surgeon named Percival Pott had argued that cancer of the scrotum, endemic among chimney sweeps, was caused by chronic exposure to chimney soot and smoke. These observations had led to a theory called the somatic mutation hypothesis of cancer. The somatic theory of cancer argued that environmental carcinogens, such as soot or radium, somehow permanently altered the structure of the cell and thus caused cancer. But the precise nature of the altercation was unknown. Clearly, soot, paraffin, and radium possessed the capacity to alter a cell in some fundamental way to generate a malignant cell. But how could such a diverse range of insults all converge on the same pathological insult? Perhaps a more systemic explanation was missing, a deeper, more fundamental theory of carcinogenesis. In 1910, unwittingly, Roos threw the somatic theory into grave doubt. Experimenting with the spindle cell sarcoma, Roos injected the tumor in one chicken into another chicken and found that the tumor could be transmitted from one bird to another. I have propagated a spindle cell sarcoma of the common fowl into its 4th generation, he wrote. The neoplasm grows rapidly, infiltrates, metastasizes, and remains true to type. This was curious, but nonetheless still understandable. Cancer was a disease of cellular origin, and transferring cells from one organism to another might have been expected to transmit the cancer. But then Roos stumbled on a more peculiar result. Shuttling tumors from one bird to another, he began to pass the cells through a set of filters, a series of finer and finer cellular sieves, until the cells had been eliminated from the mix, and all that was left was the filtrate derived from the cells. Roos expected the tumor transmission to stop, but instead the tumors continued propagating with a ghostly efficacy, at times even increasing on transmissibility as the cells had progressively vanished. The agent responsible for carrying the cancer, Roos concluded, was not a cell or an environmental carcinogen, but some tiny particle lurking within the cell. The particle was so small that it could easily pass through most filters and keep producing cancer in animals. The only biological particle that had these properties was a virus. His virus was called Roos sarcoma virus, or RSV for short. And that's another break. I had this piece that I wanted to do. Oh, I had the piece. Where's the piece? Who knows where the piece is? Oh, here it is. Boom, we got it. Okay. I'll clean up the mess that I had made in the last vlog. Give me a second. Oh, that's so much paper, dude. What the fuck? Okay, there we go. Relatively easy. Just jumbled everything back together. Alright. Oh. Quite dusty now, I'm afraid. If I start sneezing, you'll know why. Oh, man. The discovery of RSV, the first cancer-causing virus, felled a deep blow to the somatic mutation theory and set off a frantic search for more cancer viruses. The causal agent for cancer seemed to have been found. In 1935, a colleague of Roos's named Richard Shope reported a papillomavirus that caused wart-like tumors in cottontail rabbits. 10 years later, in the mid-1940s, came news of a leukemia-causing virus in mice and then in cats, but still no signs of a bona fide cancer virus in humans. In 1958, after nearly a 3-decade effort, the hunt finally yielded an important prize. An Irish surgeon, Denise Burkitt, discovered an aggressive form of lymphoma, now called Burkitt's lymphoma, that occurred endemically among children in the malaria-ridden belt of sub-Saharan Africa. The pattern of distribution suggested an infectious cause. When 2 British virologists analyzed the lymphoma cells from Africa, they discovered an infectious agent lodged inside them, not malaria parasites, but a human cancer virus. The new virus was called Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV. EBV is more familiar to us as the virus that causes infectious mononucleosis, or mono. The grand total of cancer-causing viruses in humans now stood at 1. But the modesty of that number aside, the cancer virus theory was in full spate now, in part because viruses were the new rage in all of medicine. Viral diseases, having been considered incurable for centuries, were now becoming potentially preventable. The polio vaccine, introduced in the summer of 1952, had been a phenomenal success, and the notion that cancer and infectious diseases could eventually collapse into a single pathological entity was simply too seductive to resist. Cancer may be infectious, a Life magazine cover piece asserted in 1962. Roos received hundreds of letters from anxious men and women asking about exposures to cancer-causing bacteria or viruses. Speculation soon inched towards hysteria and fear. One woman, if cancer was infectious, some wondered, why not quarantine patients to prevent its spread? Why not send cancer patients to sanitation wards or isolation facilities where TB and smallpox victims had once been confined? One woman who believed that she had been exposed to a coughing lung cancer patient wrote, "Is there something I can do to kill the cancer germ? Can the rooms be fumigated? Should I give up my lease and move out?" If the cancer germ had infected one space most acutely, it was the imagination of the public, and equally the imagination of researchers. Farber turned into a particularly fervent believer. In the early 1960s, goaded by his insistence, the NCI inaugurated a special virus cancer program, a systemic hunt for human cancer viruses patterned explicitly after the chemotherapy discovery program. The project snowballed into public prominence, gathering enormous support. Hundreds of monkeys at the NCI-funded labs were inoculated with human tumors with the hopes of turning the monkeys into viral incubators for vaccine development. Unfortunately, the monkeys failed to produce even a single cancer virus, but nothing dimmed the optimism. Over the next decade, the cancer virus program siphoned away more than 10% of the NCI contract budget, nearly $500 million. In contrast, the Institute's cancer nutrition program, meant to evaluate the role of diet in cancer, a question of at least equal import, received 1/20th of that allocation. Peyton Roos was rehabilitated into the scientific mainstream and levitated into permanent scientific sainthood. In 1966, having been overlooked for a full 55 years, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. On the evening of December 10th, at the ceremony in Stockholm, he rose to the program like a resurrected messiah. Roos acknowledged in his talk that the virus theory of cancer still needed much more work and clarity. Relatively few viruses have any connection with the production of neoplasms, Roos said, but bulldogish and unwilling to capitulate, Roos lambasted the idea that cancer could be caused by something inherent to the cells, such as a genetic mutation. A favorite explanation has been that oncogenes cause alterations in the genes of the cells of the body, somatic mutations as these are termed, but numerous facts, when taken together, decisively exclude this supposition. He groused elsewhere. Where have been the fruits of this somatic mutation hypothesis? Most serious of all the results of the somatic mutation hypothesis has been its effect on research workers. It acts as a tranquilizer on those who believe it. Roos had his own tranquilizer to offer, a unifying hypothesis that viruses cause cancer. And many in his audience, in no mood for caveats on complexities, were desperate to swallow his medicine. The somatic mutation theory of cancer was dead. The scientists who had studied environmental carcinogenesis needed to think of any other explanations why radium or soot might cause cancer. Perhaps, the virus theorists reasoned, these insults activated endogenous viruses. Oh, man. Okay, let's go. We have 3 pages. 2 superficial theories were thus stitched audaciously and prematurely into one comprehensive whole. One offered a cause, viruses called cancer, although a vast majority of them were yet undiscovered. The second one offered a cure. Particular combinations of cytotoxic poisons would cure cancer, although specific combinations for the vast majority of cancers were yet undiscovered. Viral carcinogenesis clearly demanded a deeper explanation. How might viruses, elemental microbes floating from cell to cell, cause so profound a change in the cell's physiology as to create a malignant cell? The success of cytotoxic chemotherapy provoked equally fundamental questions. Why had a series of rather general poisons cured some forms of cancer, while leaving other forms completely unscathed? Obviously, a more fundamental question lurked beneath all of this, an explanation that would connect cause and cure. So some researchers urged patience, diligence, and time. The program directed by the NCI had been derided as one that puts the cart before the horse by searching for a cure before ignoring the cause, Kenneth Endicott, the NCI director, acknowledged in 1963. We have certainly not found a cure for cancer. We have a dozen chemicals which are somewhat better than those known before the program began, but none are dramatically better. They prolong the patient's life somewhat and make him more comfortable, but that is all. But the Lascarites had little time for such nuanced descriptions of progress. This cart would have to drag the horse. The iron is hot, and this is the time to pound without cessation, Farber wrote to Lasker. The groundwork for an all-out battle had already been laid. All that was necessary was to put pressure on Congress to release funds. No large mission or goal-oriented effort against cancer, supported with adequate funds, has ever been organized, Murray Lasker announced in an open letter to Congress in 1969. Lasker's thoughts were echoed by Solomon Garb, a little-known professor of pharmacology at the University of Missouri, who shot to prominence by publishing the book A Cure for Cancer, a National Goal, in 1968. The theme of this book, Garber began, is that the time has come for a closer look at cancer research and for a new consolidation of effort aimed at cure or control of cancer. And for a major hindrance to cancer effort has been a chronic severe shortage of funds, a situation that is not generally recognized. It is not, however, to point this out or to repeat it. It is also necessary it is not enough, however, to point this out or to repeat it. It is also necessary to explain how additional funds would be used, what projects they would pay for, why such projects deserve support, and where the skilled scientists and technicians to do the work would come from. Garb's book was described as a springboard to progress, and the Lascarites certainly sprung. As with Farber, A doctor's word was the ultimate prescription. That Garb had prescribed precisely this strategy advocated by the Lascarites immediately transformed him, in their eyes, into a messianic figure. His book became their Bible. Religious movements and cults are often founded on a tetrad of elements: a prophet, a prophecy, a book, and a revelation. By December of 1969, the Cancer Crusade had acquired 3 of these 4 essential elements. Its prophet was Mary Lasker, the woman who had guided it out of the dark wilderness of the 1950s into national prominence just 2 decades later. Its prophecy was the cure for childhood leukemia, inaugurated by Farber's experiments in Boston and ending with Pinkel's astonishing successes in Memphis. Its book was Garb's cure for cancer. The final missing element was a revelation, a sign that would augur the future and capture the imagination of the public. In the spirit of all great revelations, this one would also appear quite unexpectedly and mystically out of the blue. It would appear quite literally from the heavens. I feel like I'm reading way too fast, but my mouth is kinda urging me to stop, but I won't stop. No, I won't stop. At 4:17 p.m. EDT on July 20th, 1969, a 15-ton spacecraft moved silently through the cold, thin atmosphere above the moon and landed on the rocky basalt crater on the lunar surface. A vast barren landscape of magnificent desolation stretched out around the spacecraft. It suddenly struck me, one of the 2 astronauts would recall, that this tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put my thumb and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet. On that pea-sized blue planet glimmering on the horizon, this was a moment of reckoning. It was a stunning scientific and intellectual accomplishment, Time reported in July 1969, for a creature who, in the space of a few million years, an instant in evolutionary chronology, emerged from primeval forests to hurl himself at the stars. It was, in any event, a shining reaffirmation of the optimistic premise that whatever man imagines, he can bring to pass. The Cancer Crusaders could not have asked for a more exuberant vindication of their own project. Here was another programmatic effort, planned, targeted, goal-oriented, and intensely focused, that had delivered its results in record time. When Max Faget, the Faget, the famously taciturn engineer of the Apollo program, was later asked to comment on the principal scientific challenge of the moon landing, he could only come up with a single word: propulsion. The impression was that the moonwalk had turned out to be a technological cakewalk, no more complicated than building a more powerful jet engine, magnifying it several dozenfold, and pointing it vertically at the moon. The Lascarites, transfixed in front of their flickering television sets in Boston, Washington, and New York on the evening of the moon landing, were primed to pick up on all these analogies. Like Faget, they believed that the missing element in the Cancer Crusade was some sort of propulsion, a simple internal vertical thrust that would transform the scale and scope of their efforts and catapult them towards the cure. In fact, the mission propulsion, they believed, had been found. The success against childhood leukemia, and more recently Hodgkin's disease, stood out as proof of principle, the first hesitant explorations of a vast unexplored space. Cancer, like the moon, was also a landscape of magnificent desolation, but a landscape on the verge of discovery. In her letters, Mary Lasker began to refer to a programmatic war on cancer as the conquest of inner space, as opposed to outer space, instantly unifying the 2 projects. The moon landing thus marked a turning point in the life cycle of the Cancer Crusade. In the past, the Lascarites had concentrated much of their efforts on political lobbying in Washington. When advertisements or posters had been pitched directly to the public, they had mainly been educational. The Lascarites had preferred to maneuver backstage, preferring political advocacy to public advocacy. But by 1969, politics had changed. Lister Hill, the Alabama senator and one of Mary Lasker's strongest supporters, was retiring after several decades in the Senate. Senator Edward Kennedy, Farber's ally from Boston, was so deeply embroiled in the Chappaquiddick scandal that he had virtually disappeared into legislative oblivion. For context, in July 1969, a car carrying Kennedy and a campaign worker veered off of Martha's Vineyard Bridge and sank underwater, drowning his passenger. Kennedy pleaded guilty for leaving the crime scene and received a suspended sentence. That's what the Chappaquiddick scandal was. The Lascarites were now deeply orphaned. "We're in the worst," Lasker recalled. "We're back to a phase that we were in the early 1950s, when we had no friend in the Senate. We went on constantly, but no effective sympathy." With their voices now muted in Washington, with little sympathy in the House and no friend in the Senate, the Lascarites were forced to revamp their strategy for their crusade. From backstage political maneuvering to front-stage public mobilization. In retrospect, that turn in their trajectory was well-timed. The success of Apollo 11 may have dramatically affected the Lascarites' own view of their project, but more important perhaps, it created an equally seismic shift in the public perception of science. That cancer could be conquered, just as the moon had been conquered, was scarcely a matter of doubt. The Lascarites coined the phrase to describe this analogy. They called it a moonshot of cancer. For cancer, sorry. And that's the end of the chapter. And that's my cure to end this vlog, because my mouth is suffering, absolutely suffering. Oh man, alright. Yep, you know what time it is. It's time to end this damn vlog. Yep.